Hi, this is David Bansal. I'm an author and a life coach in the art of conscious living. I have made myself available here with just one simple intention to spread the right awareness about the phenomena of life, what many people today call as manifestation. So, in this video, we will be covering the concept of the conscious of being and what does it really mean to be conscious of being, which was first given by Neville Goddard. So, it starts with a simple and basic question. Have you ever wanted something so badly, but at the same time, you constantly imagined losing it? Perhaps you have wanted a particular relationship, or a particular job, financial security, or good health, or some other outcome, and yet your mind keeps returning to the possibility that something might go wrong. You may tell yourself that you're trying to remain positive, but internally, you are constantly asking, what if they leave me? Or what would happen if I fail? What if I lose everything? What if something happens? And most people really do not recognize how significant this is. They believe that because they consciously want the positive outcome, that is what they're occupying internally. But there can be tremendous difference between what you consciously say you want and what you actually become of conscious of being. And this is where one of the Neville Goddard's most important idea becomes extremely practical. The idea of being conscious of being something. And to understand it properly, I want to tell you a story. It is a very simple story about a sage and a bird. But underneath the story is a profound lesson about imagination, our fears, our assumptions, and the state of consciousness from which we live our lives. So once there was a sage who lived peacefully in the forest. He spent his days in solitude, observing nature, meditating, and living a very simple life. One day, while walking through the forest, the sage discovered a very beautiful bird. This was not an ordinary bird, it was extremely rare, and because of its rarity, hunters had begun searching for it. They wanted to capture the bird, and some of them wanted to kill it because its rarity made its value but inflate. And when the sage realized that the bird was being hunted, he immediately felt the compassion for it. He decided that he had to save it. So he took the bird with him and began running through the forest. He ran farther and farther away from the hunters. He wanted to put as much distance possible between the bird and the people who were trying to kill it. Eventually, after following him for some time, hunters lost track of him and moved on. But the sage did not stop. He kept on running and running and running. He had become so concerned about the possibility of the bird being discovered that he could no longer trust that it was safe, even though the hunters were no longer following him. He continued moving deeper and deeper through the forest because he thought, what if they find us? What if another hunter comes? What if someone sees the bird? What if I stop too soon and something happens to it, the bird? So he kept on going. He ran for days until eventually he reached the other side of the forest. And there he finally decided that he had gone far enough to be safe. And the hunters were nowhere to be seen, and he believed that he was successfully taken the bird to somewhere safe. And the sage settled down in this new place. He built a new home, began living there with the bird. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. The bird was alive, hunters were far away, the immediate danger had disappeared. The sage has successfully protected the bird and brought it somewhere where he believed it could live safely. But there was a problem. Although the physical danger has disappeared, the sage's consciousness of danger had not disappeared. Every day, he looked at the bird and worried about it. Every morning, noon, and night. He would think, I hope nothing happens to that bird. Then another thought would come, what if some hunter would eventually find us? What if somebody discovers how rare that bird is? What if somebody kills it? What if I lose it? He loved the bird, And because he loved it, he became increasingly afraid of losing it. And the strange thing was that Sage wasn't consciously trying to create the death of the bird. He desperately wanted exact opposite of it. He wanted to save it. He wanted to live. But instead allowing himself to experience the bird as safe, he repeatedly imagined bird being in danger. He mentally rehearsed the possibility of its death. He imagined what it felt like if the bird were suddenly killed. He imagined hunters finding it, and he imagined all the nonsense of this world. Then he would look at the bird and feel relieved that it was still alive. But the next day he would begin worrying about it again. This continued day after day and night after night. And then one afternoon, something extraordinary happened. The sage was sitting outside his home when suddenly an arrow came flying through the air, and the arrow struck the bird, and the bird died. The sage was completely devastated. He couldn't understand how this could possibly have happened. He had carried the bird all the way across the forest. He had escaped the hunters. He had gone somewhere completely different. He had built a new home where he believed that place was safe. He had done everything he could think of to protect the bird. But yet, the bird was dead. Later, he discovered something astonishing. The hunters had not been anywhere near his new home. They had been on the other side of the forest hunting another bird. They had fired an arrow at the bird, but the arrow missed it. Arrow missed its intended target and traveled an enormous distance through the forest. It crossed the entire forest and eventually struck the bird, struck the sage's bird, that beautiful endangered bird. The sage had escaped the hunters, but he had never escaped the consciousness of danger. Now, I want to make something very clear. This story is not meant to be taken as literal explanation that every fearful thought physically causes an arrow to fly across the forest. That is not my point. The story is spiritual illustration of something much deeper. The sage changed his circumstances, but he did not change his consciousness. He changed his location, but he did not change his state of being. He physically moved away from the danger, but internally he continued to live as the man who was in danger. And this is precisely where Neville Goddard's teaching about consciousness of being becomes so interesting. Because Neville is not simply asking what you want. He's asking you to examine the state from which you are living, what you are conscious of being. What have you accepted yourself to be? What reality you have become familiar with internally? What do you repeatedly assume about yourself, other people, and your future? These questions go much deeper than simply asking what you want. So the phrase conscious of being can sound complicated when you first hear it. And I have seen this misunderstanding about this throughout all the platforms of manifestation, right from YouTube to Discord servers and Reddit. At its simplest level, being conscious of being something means that you have accepted a particular state as a description of yourself. It is the way you experience yourself internally. For example, there is a difference between I want to be wealthy and being conscious of being wealthy. So when you say I want to be wealthy, you are identifying yourself as the person who does not have wealth yet. Wealth exists somewhere outside of you and you're waiting for it to arrive. But when you become conscious of being wealthy, you're no longer relating to the wealth merely as something you hope to acquire in the future. You're imagining and accepting yourself as the person for whom financial security is already a reality. And the same thing applies to love. There's a difference between saying, I want someone to love me, and being conscious of being loved. There's a difference between saying, I hope this person chooses me, and being conscious of being chosen. There's a difference between saying, I hope my relationship works, and being conscious of being insecure and loving relationship. These may appear to be very subtle differences in language and tenses, but they represent completely different inner position. One position is waiting, other position is experiencing. One is hoping to become, other is identifying as. And that is what Neville is pointing toward when he talks about consciousness. So now if we return to the same story, now return to the sage. What did the sage want? He wanted the bird to be safe. If you had asked him directly, face to face, do you want this bird to die? He would have immediately said no. No. He loved the bird, he protected the bird. He carried it across the entire forest. He gave up his old home. He created a new home for it. Everything he did outwardly was directed towards protecting this bird. And yet, internally, he repeatedly experienced another reality. He was constantly conscious of being possibility that the bird could die. This is one of the most important distinctions you can understand about Neville's teaching. Your desire and your state are not necessarily the same thing. You can desire love while being conscious of being rejected. You can desire success while being conscious of failure. You can desire abundance while being conscious of lack. You can desire peace while conscious of danger. Why prepare for war when you want peace? Isn't this is something which is happening in this world? Everyone is preparing for the war, stockpiling the biggest of weapons while they are promoting peace. You can desire a relationship while being conscious of abandonment. You can want something desperately and still repeatedly occupy the state of not having it. That is why simply asking yourself, what do I want, isn't enough. You also need to ask, what I am conscious of being. So let us take a very simple example once again. Imagine someone who says, I want to be confident. Now imagine another person who thinks I am confident. These statements describe two identities. First person who says, I want to be confident, is looking at confidence as something they need to acquire. And the second person who said, I am confident, is accepting confidence as a part of who they are. The same distinction exists with the relationship. Now imagine someone saying, I really want this person to love me. Now imagine another person who internally experiences I am being loved. The first person is actually waiting for the evidence, and the second person is occupying an assumption. The first person is constantly asking, is it happening? And the second person is already accepted as a truth of their life internally. And that is why Neville's teaching is so much deeper than simply repeating positive statement. You can repeat I am loved 1,000 times while internally thinking, why hasn't this person contacted me yet? It's been 2 months since I am doing these affirmations. What if they leave? What if they found somebody else? Many people have asked me this question. So this is my answer to them. And this is not something rude I am saying to them. I am just presenting a truth to them. Your words may be positive, but your dominant inner position may still be the person who is afraid of being rejected. And nobody can tell you this. Only you yourself can disclose the secret. That what you are conscious of being. If you put up all your problems, queries, and what you have been doing from past 3 months, like I'm doing this and that in manifestation, can you tell me where I am wrong? I can tell you, maybe suggest you something, but the real truth, what you're conscious of being, this is the work of you. Only you can tell. No person in this world can tell. Only you can tell what you're conscious of being. So the deeper question is, what state are you inhabiting? Now this is where the story becomes especially relevant to the everyday life. Suppose someone wants a relationship and they say, I want love. But throughout the day, their mind repeats and repeatedly asks, what if they leave me? What if they lose interest in me? What if they meet someone else? What if I'm not enough? What if this relationship doesn't work? They may genuinely want love. What's wrong in that? But what they're repeatedly practicing, they are practicing the state of being someone who's afraid of losing love. They're emotionally rehearsing abandonment. They're imagining continuous rejection. They are preparing themselves for the disappointment. They are repeatedly experiencing a future in which the thing they love disappears. And because they are repeatedly visiting that state and thought, it becomes familiar. And that what we need to understand about consciousness, what you're aware of being. The mind doesn't only respond to what you consciously say you want, it also becomes familiar with what you repeatedly imagine and assume or think about it. And this is where someone might say, but I'm only worried because I care about it. I'm not trying to create a negative outcome. And of course, that's true. The sage cared about the bird. His fear came from love. But that is precisely what makes the story so powerful. The problem wasn't his intention. No, that wasn't the problem. His intention was absolutely good to save the bird. The problem was the state he repeatedly occupied. He loved the bird, but he kept imagining losing it. He wanted safety, but he repeatedly experienced the danger internally. And this happens constantly in our lives. Our parents worried about the child because they love them. A person worried about their relationship because they love their partner. Someone worries about their money because they want financial security. A student worries about an examination because they desperately want to succeed. That desire itself isn't the problem. The question is what happens internally when you are pursuing the desire. You're experiencing yourself as a person who already possesses the desired quality, or are you experiencing yourself as a person who's desperately trying to prevent its opposite? Now, this doesn't mean you should become terrified of every negative thought. That is extremely important. Neville's teaching should not become another reason for you to monitor yourself every single second of the day. You are a human being. You will have random thoughts. You will sometimes worry. You will sometimes feel doubt. You will sometimes imagine something going wrong. That doesn't mean you have created some terrible future. The important question is not whether an unwanted thoughts ever enters your mind. The important question is, what state do you repeatedly return to? What becomes your psychological home? What do you habitually expect? What do you repeatedly imagine? What identity feels most naturally to you? What is more important than a random thought that appears and disappears? The sage didn't simply had one passing thought about the bird that it might die. He repeatedly lived from that fear. That particular scene became an inner atmosphere of fear that became his habitual state. So you do not have to worry about one single passing thought, maybe a couple of times. That is absolutely fine. You're a human. But if you're living in that thought continuously 24/7, that becomes your state. So one might ask, what is your home state? Every person has certain state that feels natural to them. For some people, being confident feels natural. For others, insecurity feels natural. For some people, expecting success feels natural. For others, expecting disappointment feels natural. For some people, being loved feels natural. For others, constantly questioning whether they are loved feels natural. For some people, abundance feels natural. For others, worrying about the money feels natural. And often we don't even realize that these are the state of consciousness. We simply call them, this is my personality. We say, I'm just an anxious person. I'm just unlucky one. I'm just unlucky in relationship. Things never work out for me usually. I'm bad with money. I'm not confident. But these statements are description of your identity and they are description of your being. And then Neville invites you to question whether the identity you have become accustomed to it's actually the identity you want to continue to inhabit. Do you want this to continue? Now, this is where the power of I amness comes here. And this is why the word I am are so important in Neville's teaching. So, whatever follows I am, that becomes your identity, identification, just like identity card. I am what? Unlucky. I am rejected. I am always struggling. I am behind. I'm not enough. I'm loved. I'm secure. I am successful. I am capable. I am wealthy. I am at peace. Notice that the word I am themselves are not changing. What changes is the identity you place after them. And this is why conscious creation begins at the level of being, and that is your I amness. You're always conscious of being something. The question is whether you're consciously choosing the identity or unconsciously repeating one that you have learned from your past, maybe from your parents, from your experience of life. Think about how often people carry old experiences into new circumstances. If someone was rejected once, now they become conscious of being of someone who always gets rejected. And there's no point in it, but they still do it. Someone was cheated on once. Now they become conscious of being someone who cannot trust anyone about love. Someone failed an exam. Now they become conscious of being someone who isn't capable of the exams. If someone was criticized, now they become conscious of being someone who is not good enough. The event happened, but then the event became an identity. And this is where the problem begins. The sage in the story had escaped the physical hunters, but he continued carrying the psychological experience of being hunted. In the exactly same way, you cannot leave an old circumstances while continuing to live from the identity that circumstances has created. The forest can change while the consciousness remains the same. And perhaps this is the central lesson of this story. The sage changed his location, but he didn't change his state. And people do this all the time. They move from one city to another and expect to feel different, but they carry the same insecurity. They enter a new relationship and they expect to feel loved, but carry the same fear of abandonment. They get a new job and expect to feel successful, but carry the same fear of failure. They make more money, but continue thinking someone like who's constantly about to lose it. They change their circumstances, but the old consciousness follows them. And Neville's approach is different. He says, in effect, don't merely rearrange the external circumstances. Become conscious of being the person who already possesses the state you desire. Now, the point here is the sage was living in the wrong end. Now, you must have heard the term living in the end by Neville. But I say to you, the sage was living in the wrong end. Now we can return to this story once again, and Sage was actually living in the end. He simply happened to be living in the end he feared. He repeatedly imagined the bird being killed. He repeatedly experienced the possibility of losing it. He constantly rehearsed the unwanted ending, and this is why this story is so much powerful illustration of this principle. The lesson is not merely don't think negative thought. The deeper lesson is be careful what state you make yourself familiar with, because what you repeatedly rehearse, the important term here is repeatedly, not once, not twice, repeatedly, because what you repeatedly rehearse internally can become the lens through which you experience yourself and your life. But one important thing I want to say, do not turn this into fear of manifestation. There's a danger in misunderstanding this teaching. Someone hears all of this and starts thinking, I had one negative thought today, so now I have manifested something terrible. And that is not freedom. That is another form of anxiety. You do not need to become afraid of your own mind. You do not need to inspect every thought and be scared of it. You do not need to punish yourself for experiencing a fear. You do not need to force yourself to be positive every second. Instead, just become aware. When you notice that you have returned to the old state, simply recognize it. Okay, I acknowledge it. I've done this, I've imagined this, okay. Then you can say to yourself, I have been living from that assumption that I am not secure. Now I choose not to. Now simply choose another assumption. Just acknowledge and then move on. You return to the state you prefer, and that is more than enough here. So now, if I have to give you a final lesson, the Neville Goddard's teaching about consciousness of being is ultimately an invitation to examine ourselves, our own identity. You're always being something, always and always. You're always experiencing yourself from some position in life. You may be conscious of being rejected, or being loved, or being poor, or being abundant, or being unsuccessful, or being successful. The important question is not simply which one do I want. The important question is which one am I repeatedly accepting as myself, because that is the state you are living from. So you don't become obsessed with controlling every thought. Don't become frightened of your own imagination. Don't start believing that one negative thought that will destroy your future. No. Instead, just become conscious. Watch yourself. Listen to your inner conversation. Notice what you are repeatedly expecting. Notice the identity you naturally return to. And when you discover that you have been living as a sage who's constantly waiting for the arrow, you don't need to condemn yourself. You simply stop running and breathe, and you turn your attention inward and simply ask, if my desire were already fulfilled, who would I be? Then become familiar with that person. If you were already loved, become familiar with being loved. If you're already successful, become familiar with the success. You don't need to know exactly how it will happen. You don't need to control every person, every circumstance. You don't need to know where the arrow will come from. You need to know that state you are choosing to inhabit. That's it. Because perhaps the greatest mistake we make is thinking that our job is to control the forest. We spend our lives trying to move further away from the hunters, trying to eliminate every possible dangers and trying to make sure that nothing goes wrong. But Neville's word and teaching asks us to look somewhere else. Look at the person who is doing the running. Look at the identity behind the fear. Look at the consciousness from which you are living. And then simply ask, who am I conscious of being? And that is the question. Who am I being right now? Because you can cross the entire forest and still carry the same consciousness with you. You can change your circumstances and carry the same assumption. You can change your environment and carry the same identity. But when the state changes, something fundamentally different begins. You're no longer merely trying to escape the old reality. You're occupying the new one internally. And that is what it means to become conscious of being. And just simply know, this is who I am. And perhaps that is the heart of Neville Goddard's teaching. Your task is not merely to get something. Your task is to become conscious of being the person who already has it. And that is the consciousness of being. And that is the story of man.